In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Seattle, where perfectly manicured lawns lined the streets and neighbors exchanged friendly waves, no one suspected the darkness that lurked behind the walls of house number 1247. For years, a young girl lived in silent desperation, her story unknown to the world outside, until one brave teacher's intuition would change everything. The girl, who we'll call Rose to protect her identity, learned to make herself invisible from an early age. She moved through the halls of her high school like a shadow, always wearing long-sleeved clothes regardless of the weather, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her father, a respected IT professional in the community, had carefully crafted an image of a hard-working single parent doing his best to raise his daughter after his wife's passing when Rose was just 5. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, Rose's life was nothing like the picture-perfect image her father presented to the world. Her days were filled with strict rules that grew increasingly oppressive as she got older. Simple teenage activities like having a phone, going to friends' houses, or participating in after-school activities were completely forbidden. Her father monitored every minute of her day, installing cameras throughout their house and tracking software on her school-issued laptop. Mrs. Chen, Rose's freshman English teacher, noticed something wasn't quite right during the first few weeks of the school year. Unlike other students who gradually opened up as the semester progressed, Rose seemed to withdraw further into herself. Her essays, while beautifully written, carried an undercurrent of sadness that worried the experienced teacher. When asked about her home life, Rose would give carefully rehearsed answers about her loving father who worked hard to provide for her. The turning point came during a routine creative writing assignment. Students were asked to write about their safe place, a location where they felt most at peace. While other students wrote about their bedrooms, favorite parks, or grandparents' homes, Rose's essay described the school library during lunch break. It wasn't the choice of location that alarmed Mrs. Chen, it was the way Rose described it as the only place where she could breathe freely, away from the watching eyes. That essay prompted Mrs. Chen to pay closer attention. She noticed how Rose would linger in the classroom after the final bell, reluctant to head home. How she never ate lunch with other students, instead hiding away in the library with a book. How she flinched at sudden movements and loud noises. The signs were subtle but increasingly concerning. Mrs. Chen began keeping a detailed log of her observations. She noted how Rose would miss school on random days and return with barely believable excuses written in what appeared to be her father's handwriting. How she wore the same 3 outfits on rotation, despite her father's apparent financial stability. How she never participated in class discussions about family or home life. As winter approached, Rose's attendance became more sporadic. When she did come to class, dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. Her normally impeccable homework started showing signs of rushing, with uncharacteristic mistakes scattered throughout. The spark of intelligence in her eyes seemed to dim with each passing week. One particularly cold November morning, Rose arrived at school an hour early, shivering in her thin jacket. Mrs. Chen, who was preparing for the day's lessons, found her huddled in the hallway outside the classroom. That morning, through gentle questioning and patient silence, Mrs. Chen finally learned fragments of the truth. Rose's carefully constructed walls began to crack, revealing glimpses of the horror she endured at home. The young girl spoke in whispers, her words painting a picture of isolation and fear. She described a life of constant surveillance, where every minute was monitored and controlled. Her father had gradually cut off all contact with the outside world, convincing her that no one would believe her if she ever spoke up. He had created an environment of complete dependence, making Rose believe that she wouldn't survive without him. Mrs. Chen listened with growing concern, her heart breaking for the young girl who had endured so much in silence. She knew that the next steps would be crucial. Any wrong move could spook Rose's father and make the situation even more dangerous. With Rose's permission, Mrs. Chen began documenting everything, preparing to involve the proper authorities in a way that would ensure Rose's safety. As the first bell rang and students began filling the hallways, Mrs. Chen made a promise to herself and to Rose. This wouldn't be another case of a child falling through the cracks of the system. She would do everything in her power to help this young girl find her way to freedom, no matter what it took. Little did she know, her decision that morning would set in motion a chain of events that would change Rose's life forever. The school day proceeded as usual, but beneath the surface, wheels were beginning to turn. Mrs. Chen's detailed observations, combined with Rose's own account, would soon reach the ears of those who could help. The quiet suburban neighborhood had no idea that it was about to become the center of a rescue operation that would reveal the dark secrets hidden behind one of its perfectly maintained facades. The following day began like any other at Washington High School, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in the administrative offices. Mrs. Chen had arrived early, clutching a thick folder containing weeks of documented observations, Rose's essays, and her own detailed notes from their conversation. The school counselor and principal sat in somber silence as she presented her findings. The school's response was swift but careful. They knew that involving Child Protective Services, CPS, required delicate handling. One wrong move could alert Rose's father and potentially make her situation even more dangerous. The principal, a veteran educator with 30 years of experience, had seen similar cases before and understood the importance of timing and discretion. Meanwhile, Rose attended her classes as usual, unaware that a team of professionals was quietly assembling to help her. The school counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, began making discreet inquiries into Rose's academic history. What she discovered was troubling. Rose had been transferred between 3 different schools in the past 5 years, each time just as teachers began noticing concerning patterns in her behavior. During lunch period, Rose sat in her usual corner of the library, attempting to complete her homework. Her father had implemented a strict rule: all homework must be finished during school hours because evenings were reserved for household duties. She hadn't told anyone about the endless list of chores that kept her up until midnight, or how she was expected to prepare elaborate meals for her father while surviving on minimal food herself. That afternoon, a CPS caseworker named Officer Thompson arrived at the school, posing as a curriculum specialist to avoid raising suspicion. She reviewed the evidence gathered by the school staff and conducted a careful interview with Rose under the guise of a student survey about school resources. The girl's answers, though guarded, painted a clear picture of systematic isolation and control. Officer Thompson's concerns deepened and she ran a background check on Rose's father. His perfect public image showed cracks under scrutiny. There were previous addresses across 3 states, each move coinciding with Rose's school transfers. More disturbing were the sealed records from Rose's early childhood, suggesting a history that someone had worked hard to hide. The investigation had to move quickly but cautiously. Rose's father worked from home most days, monitoring his daughter through an elaborate system of surveillance cameras and tracking devices. The few hours Rose spent at school were her only reprieve from his constant watching. Officer Thompson knew they needed more evidence before they could remove Rose from the home safely. Mrs. Chen noticed subtle changes in Rose over the next few days. The girl seemed more withdrawn than usual, if that was possible. During class discussions about the future, Rose's hand trembled as she took notes, and her eyes held a distant, haunted look. It was as if sharing her secret had made her more aware of its weight, and the fear of her father discovering her confession was taking its toll. The teaching assistant noticed something unusual about Rose's school laptop. Hidden beneath layers of normal student files was sophisticated tracking software that logged every keystroke and captured screenshots every 30 seconds. This discovery provided the technical evidence they needed to support Rose's account of constant surveillance. As the investigation progressed, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The school nurse reviewed Rose's medical records and found a concerning pattern of minor injuries explained away as sports accidents, despite Rose never participating in any athletic activities. The attendance office compiled a list of Rose's absences, noting that they often fell on days when teachers had scheduled parent-teacher conferences or school events. Officer Thompson worked tirelessly to build a case that would ensure Rose's safety. She coordinated with local law enforcement, domestic abuse specialists, and child psychologists to create a comprehensive intervention plan. They needed to move quickly but couldn't risk tipping off Rose's father. One mistake could send him running with Rose to another state, where the cycle would begin anew. The school staff maintained their regular routines while secretly watching for any signs that Rose was in immediate danger. Mrs. Chen kept Rose engaged with creative writing assignments, providing her with an outlet for her feelings while documenting any concerning content. Ms. Rodriguez made herself available whenever Rose needed a quiet place to decompress, gradually building trust with the frightened teenager. Rose's father, meanwhile, remained unaware that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He continued his routine of calling the school office daily to check on his daughter's attendance, his pleasant demeanor masking the control he exercised over every aspect of her life. Each call was now carefully logged and recorded, adding to the growing evidence against him. As the second week of the investigation drew to a close, Officer Thompson and her team finalized their intervention strategy. They had gathered enough evidence to obtain an emergency removal order, but executing it would require precise timing and coordination. Rose's safety during the transition would be paramount. They would only get one chance to do this right. The weight of the upcoming intervention weighed heavily on Mrs. Chen. She watched Rose leave school each afternoon, knowing the girl was returning to a house that had become her prison. But she also saw something new in Rose's eyes, a tiny spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Someone had finally seen through the carefully constructed lies, and help was coming. Little did Rose know that by this time next week, her life would change dramatically. The quiet suburban street where she lived would soon witness the culmination of weeks of careful planning, as a team of dedicated professionals prepared to rescue her from the darkness that had consumed her childhood. The countdown to freedom had begun, though the most challenging part of Rose's journey still lay ahead. The morning of the intervention arrived with a heavy fog blanketing the Seattle suburbs. Officer Thompson sat in an unmarked car 2 blocks from Rose's house, reviewing the operation details one final time. Around her, a carefully orchestrated team of police officers, CPS workers, and medical professionals waited for her signal. The plan had to be executed perfectly. Rose's safety depended on it. At school, Rose noticed something different in the air. The hallways seemed quieter, and several of her regular teachers were absent, replaced by substitutes. Mrs. Chen was there, though, providing a steady presence during first-period English. She had given the class a creative writing assignment, keeping them occupied while occasionally glancing at the clock. What Rose didn't know was that each missing teacher was part of the support team assembled for her rescue. Ms. Rodriguez, the school counselor, waited in a private room equipped with comfortable furniture and calming decorations. The school nurse had prepared a quiet medical examination room, and the principal had cleared his schedule for the entire day. The plan was set in motion when Rose's father made his usual morning call to the attendance office. The secretary, following the rehearsed script, informed him that Rose needed to stay after school for standardized testing, a common enough occurrence that wouldn't raise suspicion. His reaction was logged and added to the growing file of evidence. As the morning progressed, unmarked police vehicles quietly took up positions around the neighborhood. Officers dressed in plain clothes began their surveillance, monitoring the house for any sign that Rose's father suspected something was amiss. The fog provided perfect cover for their operations, allowing them to move undetected through the quiet streets. At precisely 11:30 a.m., Officer Thompson received word that everything was in place. She sent a coded message to the school, initiating the next phase of the plan. Mrs. Chen gently asked Rose to go to the counselor's office, saying there was a question about her latest essay. Rose gathered her things, unaware that this would be the last time she walked these halls as a prisoner of her father's control. In the counselor's office, Ms. Rodriguez greeted Rose with her usual warm smile. But today, Officer Thompson was also present, along with a child psychologist specializing in trauma cases. With gentle care, they explained to Rose what was about to happen. The fear in her eyes was immediately apparent, but there was something else too, a glimmer of desperate hope. "We know what's been happening, Rose," Officer Thompson said softly, "and we're here to make sure you're safe. You don't have to go back there ever again if you don't want to." The words hung in the air as Rose processed their meaning, years of conditioned fear battling with the promise of freedom. Meanwhile, a specialized team of computer experts had begun dismantling her father's surveillance network. They worked quickly, disabling the cameras and tracking systems one by one, ensuring he couldn't monitor Rose's movements or delete any incriminating evidence. The operation had to be precise, they couldn't risk him realizing what was happening. Rose's father, still working from his home office, remained unaware that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The first indication something was wrong came when his surveillance feeds suddenly went dark. By then, police officers were already surrounding the house, while a specialized team prepared to secure any electronic devices that could contain evidence. Back at the school, Rose listened with growing understanding as Officer Thompson explained each step of what would happen next. She would be taken to a safe location, far from her father's reach. A team of professionals was ready to help her begin the healing process. She wouldn't have to face any of this alone. The moment of truth came when Rose was asked if she was willing to leave with them. Years of psychological conditioning made her hesitate. Her father had always told her that no one would believe her, that she wouldn't survive without him. But looking at the caring faces around her, seeing the evidence they had gathered, something inside her shifted. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Yes, I want to leave." Those 3 words set the final phase into motion. While Rose remained safely at school, police officers executed their warrant at her house. Her father, caught completely off guard, was taken into custody without incident. The look of shock on his face when he realized his carefully constructed facade had crumbled was noted by several officers. As the afternoon progressed, a dedicated team of investigators began the painstaking process of documenting everything in the house. They found hidden cameras in every room, detailed logs of Rose's every movement, and a complex system of locks and alarms designed to keep her trapped. Each discovery added to the growing case against her father. Rose spent these crucial hours in the safety of the school, surrounded by the people who had worked so hard to help her. Mrs. Chen brought her favorite books from the classroom, while Ms. Rodriguez stayed close by, offering quiet support. The school nurse performed a preliminary health check, her gentle manner helping Rose feel secure. Late in the afternoon, when the house had been secured and documented, Officer Thompson drove Rose to her temporary home, a specialized youth shelter staffed by trauma-informed professionals. The facility was warm and welcoming, nothing like the sterile institution Rose had feared. Her room had a window that actually opened, and for the first time in years, there were no cameras watching her every move. That evening, as Rose sat in her new room, holding a journal given to her by Mrs. Chen, she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The world outside her window was the same as it had always been, but everything had changed. The path ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer walking it alone. Back at the police station, Officer Thompson completed her initial reports, knowing this was just the beginning of a long process. The evidence gathered would ensure Rose's father faced justice, but their primary focus remained on Rose's recovery and healing. They had removed her from danger, now the real work of helping her reclaim her life could begin. The first week of freedom brought a whirlwind of changes for Rose. The youth shelter, Haven House, became her temporary home, a place where security didn't mean surveillance, and rules existed to protect rather than control. Her room, though simple, felt like a sanctuary with its soft blue walls and a window that offered views of a flourishing garden below. The shelter's staff moved at Rose's pace, understanding that too much change too quickly could be overwhelming. Her primary counselor, Dr. Rivera, began with simple choices: what she wanted to eat, when she preferred to take her showers, which activities she'd like to try. These seemingly small decisions were monumental for someone who had been denied basic autonomy for so long. Rose's daily routine at Haven House was structured but flexible. Mornings began with breakfast in the communal dining room, where she slowly grew accustomed to eating with others. The shelter's chef, a kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Patterson, noticed Rose's hesitation around food and began teaching her about nutrition and healthy eating habits, helping her develop a better relationship with meals. Education remained a priority, but with careful consideration for Rose's emotional well-being. The shelter's tutoring program allowed her to continue her studies without immediately returning to school. Mrs. Chen visited regularly, bringing assignments and books, maintaining the educational connection that had been instrumental in Rose's rescue. One particularly meaningful moment came when Officer Thompson brought Rose's belongings from her old house. Everything had been carefully sorted and checked for tracking devices. Among the items was a small photo album Rose had kept hidden under a floorboard, containing precious photos of her mother from happier times. These fragments of her past became anchors as she began building her new life. The investigation into Rose's father continued, but the team around her was careful to shield her from unnecessary details. Instead, they focused on helping her understand that none of what happened was her fault. Dr. Rivera worked with Rose to recognize the manipulation tactics her father had used, gradually helping her unravel years of psychological conditioning. Physical health became another priority. The shelter's medical team discovered that years of nutritional neglect and stress had taken their toll. A careful health plan was developed, including regular checkups, proper nutrition, and gentle exercise. The shelter's small gym became one of Rose's favorite places, where she could literally strengthen herself while metaphorically building her resilience. Rose's legal advocate, Ms. Walsh, visited regularly to explain her rights and the legal processes ahead. These conversations were difficult but necessary. Ms. Walsh's gentle approach and clear explanations helped Rose understand that she had choices now, real choices about her future. The legal system, which had seemed so threatening when her father described it, was actually working to protect her. The shelter's art therapy program proved particularly therapeutic. Rose discovered a talent for painting, using colors and shapes to express emotions she couldn't yet put into words. Her first piece, a dark forest with a single path leading to light, became a talking point in her sessions with Dr. Rivera, helping her process her journey toward freedom. Connections with other residents at Haven House developed naturally. While each young person's story was different, they shared an understanding that words couldn't capture. During group activities, Rose began to open up, first through small smiles, then brief comments, and eventually participating in full conversations. These interactions helped her realize she wasn't alone in her healing journey. Mrs. Chen continued to be a steady presence, visiting several times a week. She brought not only schoolwork but also news from other teachers and classmates who missed her. These connections to her school life helped Rose maintain a sense of normalcy and gave her something to look forward to. The English teacher's unwavering support reminded Rose that someone had believed in her enough to take action. 1 month into her stay at Haven House, Rose faced a significant milestone, her first court hearing. Though she wouldn't have to see her father, the prospect of her testimony being used in court was daunting. The support team worked together to prepare her, with Dr. Rivera helping her process her anxiety, and Ms. Walsh explaining exactly what would happen. The day before the hearing, Rose received an unexpected gift from her art therapy group, a handmade bracelet where each bead represented a different person supporting her. Blue for Mrs. Chen, green for Officer Thompson, purple for Dr. Rivera, and so on. The physical reminder of her support system helped her feel stronger as she faced this challenge. Technology, which had once been used to control and monitor her, slowly became a tool for healing. Under the guidance of the shelter's IT specialist, Rose learned to use computers safely. She started a private digital journal, began researching topics that interested her, and even took virtual museum tours, experiencing the world that had been kept from her for so long. The shelter's garden became another source of healing. Rose joined the gardening program, learning to nurture plants from seed to bloom. The metaphor wasn't lost on her or her therapist. Like these plants, she too was growing stronger with proper care and attention. Watching seeds she planted push through the soil and reach for the sun became a powerful symbol of her own resilience. As the weeks progressed, small victories accumulated. Rose began sleeping through the night more often. She learned to voice her preferences without fear. She started making plans for the future, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Each step forward was celebrated by her support team, who understood that healing isn't linear but happens in countless small moments of growth. One afternoon, as Rose sat in the garden sketching the flowers she'd helped plant, she realized something had shifted inside her. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long had begun to fade, replaced by something new, hope. She wasn't naive enough to think the road ahead would be easy, but for the first time, she could envision a future filled with possibilities rather than restrictions. 3 months into her stay at Haven House, Rose's transformation was becoming more visible with each passing day. The quiet, withdrawn girl who had arrived that first evening was gradually being replaced by someone who smiled more freely and stood a little taller. The change wasn't just emotional. Proper nutrition and regular exercise had brought color to her cheeks and strength to her once fragile frame. A significant milestone approached as the shelter's team began discussing Rose's long-term placement. While Haven House had provided crucial immediate safety and support, it was designed as a temporary refuge. Rose needed a more permanent home where she could continue her journey of healing and growth. This prospect brought both excitement and anxiety. During one of their regular sessions, Dr. Rivera introduced Rose to the possibility of foster care. The therapeutic foster program they had in mind specialized in helping teenagers who had experienced trauma. These weren't just any foster parents, they were specially trained to provide the unique support Rose would need. Still, the idea of living in a family setting again stirred complex emotions. What if they're like him? Rose whispered during one session, voicing her deepest fear. Dr. Rivera helped her understand that the foster families went through extensive background checks and training. More importantly, Rose now had an entire support system watching out for her. She would never be isolated again. The search for the right foster family was methodical and careful. Ms. Walsh, Rose's legal advocate, ensured that every potential placement was thoroughly vetted. The goal wasn't just to find a safe home, but to find one where Rose could truly thrive. Several potential families were considered before they found what seemed like the perfect match. The prospective foster parents, the Hendersons, had years of experience working with teenagers from difficult backgrounds. They lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, close enough for Rose to maintain connections with her support system. Their home included a dedicated space for art, something that immediately caught Rose's attention when she saw the photos. The first meeting was arranged at Haven House, where Rose felt safe and comfortable. Mrs. Henderson, a retired school librarian, brought a collection of young adult novels she thought Rose might enjoy. Mr. Henderson, who taught music at a local community center, shared stories about the garden he maintained at home. Their gentle approach and genuine interest in Rose's thoughts and feelings made a strong impression. Meanwhile, Rose's academic progress continued to flourish. The shelter's tutoring program, combined with Mrs. Chen's regular visits, had helped her stay on track with her studies. In fact, she was excelling in several subjects, particularly creative writing and art. The possibility of returning to school, a different school, away from painful memories, began to feel less daunting. Officer Thompson remained involved, updating Rose about the legal proceedings against her father in a way that was informative but not overwhelming. The evidence gathered during the investigation, combined with Rose's carefully documented testimony, had built a strong case. Rose found comfort in knowing she wouldn't have to face him in court. Her written statement and recorded interviews would be sufficient. A breakthrough moment came during a group therapy session when Rose voluntarily shared part of her story with other residents. Her voice, though quiet, carried strength as she described how Mrs. Chen had noticed her silent calls for help. Other teenagers in the group responded with understanding and support, creating a powerful moment of connection that Dr. Rivera later described as a significant step in Rose's healing process. The shelter's art therapist helped Rose create a memory book of her time at Haven House. Each page captured moments of progress: her first successful recipe in cooking class, the garden she helped plant, the friendships she formed. This tangible record of positive memories would serve as a reminder of her strength as she prepared for the next phase of her journey. As Rose spent more time with the Hendersons during supervised visits, she began to imagine a future with them. Their home felt welcoming in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Mrs. Henderson shared Rose's love of books and art, while Mr. Henderson's calm presence and gentle humor helped ease her anxiety about male authority figures. The transition plan was carefully crafted to ensure Rose felt secure every step of the way. She would continue her therapy sessions with Dr. Rivera, maintain contact with her support team from Haven House, and have regular check-ins with her caseworker. The move would be gradual, starting with day visits and progressing to overnight stays when Rose felt ready. During this time, Rose's artistic abilities continued to develop. Her paintings, once dark and confined, began incorporating more light and open spaces. The shelter's art therapist noted how this transformation mirrored Rose's internal journey. One particular piece, a sunrise over a city skyline, was chosen to be displayed in Haven House's entrance hall, inspiring other residents with its message of hope. The support of her peer group at Haven House proved invaluable during this transition period. Other teenagers who had successfully moved to foster homes shared their experiences, offering practical advice and emotional support. These conversations helped normalize Rose's fears while also showing her that positive outcomes were possible. Rose's final week at Haven House was filled with meaningful moments. The staff organized a special dinner where each person shared a hope for her future. Mrs. Chen brought a letter of recommendation for her new school, highlighting Rose's academic strengths and creative talents. Officer Thompson gave her a journal with an inscription reminding Rose of her courage and resilience. As the day of transition approached, Rose spent time in the garden she had helped nurture. The seeds she had planted months ago were now blooming flowers, their growth mirroring her own journey from darkness to light. She carefully pressed one of the flowers into her memory book, a symbol of her time at Haven House and the growth that was possible with proper care and support. The morning Rose moved into the Hendersons' home dawned clear and bright. Her belongings, now free from hidden tracking devices and painful memories, fit into 2 suitcases, one containing clothes and necessities, the other filled with art supplies, books, and the memory book from Haven House. The Hendersons had prepared a room for her, allowing Rose to choose the colors and decorations weeks before the move. The first few days in her new home were an exercise in adjusting to normal family life, something that felt both foreign and fascinating to Rose. Simple things like family meals, where conversation flowed naturally and food wasn't used as a means of control, required a mental adjustment. Mrs. Henderson's patient explanations of daily routines and Mr. Henderson's respectful distance helped ease the transition. Rose's room became her sanctuary, but in a different way than her old room had been. This space was truly hers to personalize. The walls, painted a soft sage green of her choosing, displayed her artwork. The window seat overlooked the backyard garden, and most importantly, there were no cameras, no monitoring devices, just the peaceful privacy every teenager deserves. The Hendersons' approach to house rules provided structure while respecting Rose's autonomy. They understood her need to feel in control of her own space and activities. Instead of strict regulations, they established open communication and reasonable expectations. Rose was included in discussions about curfews, chores, and schedules, her input valued and considered. Dr. Rivera continued their therapy sessions, now focusing on helping Rose navigate the challenges of living in a family setting again. They worked through moments of anxiety and uncertainty, celebrating small victories like Rose's first time asking for seconds at dinner or feeling comfortable enough to watch TV in the living room with the Hendersons. Education took on new meaning as Rose prepared to start at her new school. The Hendersons worked with the school administration to ensure a smooth transition, sharing necessary information while protecting Rose's privacy. A meeting with her new teachers, facilitated by Mrs. Chen, helped establish a support system within the school environment. Rose's artistic talents continued to flourish in her new environment. Mr. Henderson, noticing her interest in different art forms, introduced her to watercolors and taught her basic guitar chords. The garage had been converted into an art studio, complete with natural lighting and storage for supplies. This creative space became a place where Rose could freely express herself. The relationship with her foster parents grew gradually but steadily. Mrs. Henderson's background as a librarian proved invaluable, as books became a bridge for communication. They started a two-person book club, discussing stories that sometimes paralleled Rose's experiences, allowing her to process her emotions through the safe distance of fiction. Physical health remained a priority. The Hendersons' family doctor, a warm-hearted physician named Dr. Torres, worked with Rose to address years of medical neglect. Regular checkups were scheduled, and a nutritionist helped create meal plans that would support her continuing recovery. The family's evening walks became a cherished routine, combining exercise with casual conversation. 6 weeks into her stay, Rose faced an unexpected challenge when a thunderstorm triggered memories of being locked in dark spaces. Instead of hiding her fear, she found the courage to seek comfort from Mrs. Henderson. This moment of vulnerability, met with understanding and support, marked a significant milestone in building trust with her foster family. The legal proceedings continued in the background, but Rose's involvement was carefully managed to minimize any impact on her progress. Ms. Walsh kept her informed without overwhelming her, and the Hendersons provided unwavering support during difficult days. The certainty that her father would face consequences for his actions helped Rose focus on her own healing. Rose's support network expanded to include the Hendersons' extended family and trusted friends. Sunday dinners with Mrs. Henderson's sister and her family became a weekly tradition. Rose discovered the joy of having cousins close to her age who included her in their activities without pressure or expectations. School proved to be another positive step in Rose's journey. Her new classmates, unaware of her past, knew her simply as the artistic new student who had transferred mid-year. The school counselor, briefed on her situation, maintained subtle but consistent support. Rose joined the art club and gradually began making friends who shared her interests. One particularly meaningful moment came when Rose received news that her father had pleaded guilty, sparing her from any possibility of a trial. The Hendersons held space for her complex emotions that evening, understanding that even positive news could stir up difficult feelings. They sat with her in the garden, sharing comfortable silence as she processed this turning point. The garden became Rose's special project with Mr. Henderson. Together they planned a butterfly garden, symbolizing transformation and new beginnings. Each plant was carefully chosen and tended, and Rose learned that growth, whether of flowers or people, requires patience, care, and the right environment to thrive. Mrs. Henderson's birthday celebration marked another milestone. Rose, with support from her art therapist, created a personal gift, a painted memory box filled with small treasures representing their growing bond. The emotion in Mrs. Henderson's eyes as she opened the gift showed Rose that her ability to trust and form attachments was healing. As summer approached, Rose began participating in more normal teenage activities. She attended her first sleepover at a friend's house, joined a community art class, and started learning to swim at the local pool. Each new experience was approached at her own pace, with the Hendersons providing encouragement without pressure. The transformation in Rose became evident in subtle ways. Her laughter came more easily, her posture grew more confident, and her art reflected brighter themes. During a routine check-in, Dr. Rivera noted how Rose had begun talking about future plans and dreams, a significant shift from the survival mindset she had lived with for so long. Through it all, the Hendersons maintained contact with Haven House and the original support team that had helped rescue Rose. This continuation of care provided stability while allowing Rose to build new connections and experiences. The message was clear: moving forward didn't mean leaving behind the people who had helped her find freedom. As autumn painted the Seattle suburbs in vibrant colors, Rose marked 6 months in her new home with the Hendersons. The milestone was celebrated with a small gathering in the backyard, attended by the key people who had supported her journey: Mrs. Chen, Officer Thompson, Dr. Rivera, and staff from Haven House. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, a stark contrast to the tense surveillance she had lived under just months before. Rose's academic progress had exceeded everyone's expectations. Her new school provided opportunities that would have been unthinkable in her previous life. She joined the school newspaper as an illustrator, combining her artistic talents with storytelling. Her art teacher, recognizing her potential, encouraged her to submit pieces to local youth art competitions. The first competition victory came unexpectedly. Rose's painting, titled Breaking Dawn, won first place in the city's annual Youth Art Festival. The piece depicted a bird breaking free from a cage, its wings stretching toward a sunrise. The symbolism wasn't lost on those who knew her story, but to others, it was simply a powerful artistic statement. This public recognition of her talent boosted her confidence immensely. Therapy sessions with Dr. Rivera evolved to focus more on future goals than past trauma. Rose began exploring career possibilities, particularly in art therapy, inspired by how art had helped her own healing journey. The Hendersons supported this interest by arranging for her to meet with professional art therapists who shared their experiences and insights. One significant breakthrough came during a family dinner when Rose spontaneously shared a funny story from her day at school. The simple act of speaking without first calculating the consequences of her words marked a profound shift in her healing. Mrs. Henderson later wrote in her foster care journal about the joy of hearing Rose's uninhibited laughter filling their home. The legal proceedings against Rose's father concluded with a sentence that ensured he would remain in prison for many years. While the news brought relief, it also stirred complicated emotions. Dr. Rivera helped Rose understand that it was normal to feel conflicted about the father who had both raised and harmed her. The Hendersons provided extra support during this period, respecting her need to process these feelings in her own way. Rose's growing independence manifested in various ways. She obtained her learner's permit with Mrs. Henderson's patient guidance, each driving lesson becoming an exercise in trust and confidence building. The freedom to move through the world on her own terms held special significance for someone whose movements had once been so strictly controlled. Her circle of friends expanded naturally. The art club became a second family, and Rose found herself hosting study groups in the Hendersons' dining room. These normal teenage activities, once forbidden, now filled her days with laughter and connection. Her friends knew nothing of her past trauma, accepting her as she presented herself in the present. The butterfly garden she had planted with Mr. Henderson became a symbol of her transformation. As autumn progressed, she documented the garden's changes through a series of paintings, capturing the beauty of transition and change. The project caught the attention of a local community center, leading to an invitation to teach a children's art workshop. Teaching younger children proved therapeutic in unexpected ways. Watching their uninhibited creativity helped Rose reconnect with her own childhood joy in art. The workshop's success led to a regular weekend position as a junior art instructor, providing her first experience of earning her own money and contributing to society. Mrs. Chen remained a steady presence in Rose's life, now more as a mentor than a teacher. They met monthly for coffee, discussing books, art, and Rose's growing aspirations for college. The English teacher who had first noticed Rose's silent calls for help was now helping her craft college application essays, turning her story of survival into one of triumph. The Hendersons began including Rose in more family decisions, from vacation planning to household improvements. When they discussed redecorating the living room, Rose's design suggestions were not only welcomed but implemented. This collaborative approach to family life helped heal old wounds about control and agency. A particularly moving moment came when Rose decided to create a memory gallery in her room. Unlike the hidden photos of her mother she once kept under floorboards, these memories were displayed proudly on her walls: photos with the Hendersons, art competition ribbons, candid shots with friends, and pictures from Haven House. Each image told part of her story of healing and growth. The approach of the holiday season brought new experiences and challenges. The Hendersons' extended family gathered for Thanksgiving, and Rose found herself surrounded by people who treated her as a beloved family member rather than an outsider. The contrast with her previous holidays, spent in isolation with her father, was stark but healing. Rose's involvement in the school's winter art show marked another milestone. She coordinated with other student artists, handled logistics, and even spoke briefly at the opening reception. Her ability to take on leadership roles and work collaboratively showed how far she had come from the frightened girl who once hid in the school library. The year's end brought a moment of reflection during a session with Dr. Rivera. Looking back at her journey from Haven House to her life with the Hendersons, Rose could acknowledge both her progress and ongoing challenges. She had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about building a future where the past no longer held power over her present. Officer Thompson visited shortly before Christmas, bringing news that Rose's story had helped reform policies around child abuse investigations in their state. While protecting Rose's privacy, the case had become a model for interagency cooperation and trauma-informed intervention. Rose found strength in knowing that her experience might help other children find freedom sooner. As winter settled over Seattle, Rose began working on her largest art project yet, a mural for the Haven House recreation room. The design incorporated symbols of hope and transformation, creating a visual message of encouragement for other young people beginning their own journeys to freedom. The project brought her story full circle, allowing her to give back to the community that had helped her find her way to safety. 1 year after her rescue, Rose stood in front of Haven House's newly completed recreation room, surrounded by the people who had become her extended family. The mural she had spent months creating stretched across the wall, a masterpiece of healing and hope. The image showed a path leading from darkness into light, with butterflies, blooming flowers, and birds in flight symbolizing transformation and freedom. The mural's unveiling ceremony brought together everyone who had played a role in Rose's journey. Officer Thompson, who had coordinated her rescue, smiled proudly from the audience. Mrs. Chen, whose initial concern had set everything in motion, wiped tears from her eyes as she saw her former student's artistic vision realized. Dr. Rivera watched with professional satisfaction, noting how the artwork reflected Rose's psychological growth. The Hendersons stood nearby, their presence steady and supportive as always. Over the past year, they had become more than foster parents. They had helped Rose rediscover what family truly meant. Their home was no longer just a safe place to stay, it had become her home in every sense of the word. The legal proceedings to make the arrangement permanent were already in motion. Rose's speech at the unveiling ceremony demonstrated how far she had come. Gone was the frightened girl who barely spoke above a whisper. In her place stood a confident young woman who could share her story with purpose and strength. She spoke about the power of communities coming together to protect their vulnerable members, about the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. The impact of Rose's case extended far beyond her personal journey. The coordinated response that had led to her rescue became a model for child protection services across the state. Officer Thompson had developed a training program for law enforcement, using the case as an example of how to handle similar situations with sensitivity and effectiveness. Rose's academic achievements continued to impress her teachers. Her grade point average placed her among the top students in her class, and her portfolio of artwork had caught the attention of several college art programs. Mrs. Chen, who had transitioned from teacher to mentor, helped her navigate the college application process, writing a heartfelt recommendation letter that spoke to both her artistic talent and her remarkable resilience. The butterfly garden at the Hendersons' home had become a neighborhood attraction, with local gardening enthusiasts often stopping to admire the carefully planned layout and thriving plants. Rose and Mr. Henderson had expanded it to include a small vegetable patch, and she discovered that growing her own food brought a special kind of healing. The garden became a living metaphor for her journey. With proper care and nurturing, beautiful things could grow from dark places. Rose's involvement in the community grew stronger. Besides teaching art to children at the community center, she began speaking at youth advocacy events, sharing age-appropriate versions of her story to inspire others to seek help when needed. Her message was always one of hope and empowerment, focusing on the support available rather than the trauma she had endured. The relationship with her foster siblings, the Hendersons' adult children who lived nearby, deepened into genuine friendship. Family gatherings became joyful occasions rather than sources of anxiety. Rose learned that family bonds could be built on love and respect rather than fear and control. The Hendersons' grandchildren called her Aunt Rose, a title that never failed to bring a smile to her face. As her confidence grew, Rose began exploring more aspects of normal teenage life. She went to her first school dance, joined the yearbook committee, and even tried out for the school play. Each new experience helped her rebuild the childhood that had been stolen from her. The Hendersons celebrated each milestone, understanding that even small steps forward were victories worth acknowledging. Her art continued to evolve, reflecting her healing journey. The dark, confined spaces that had dominated her early works gave way to open landscapes and bright horizons. Her art teacher entered one of her pieces, a triptych showing the stages of a butterfly's metamorphosis, in a national youth art competition, where it received honorable mention. The legacy of Rose's case led to improvements in how schools identified and reported suspected abuse. Mrs. Chen worked with educational administrators to develop training programs for teachers, helping them recognize subtle signs that might indicate a student needs help. The protocols that had helped save Rose were formalized and implemented across the district. Haven House used Rose's mural as a centerpiece for their trauma recovery program. New residents found hope in the imagery, often sitting in the recreation room to draw inspiration from the journey it depicted. The shelter's art therapy program expanded, inspired by how art had helped Rose process her experiences and find her voice. Dr. Rivera documented Rose's therapeutic journey in a case study that would help other mental health professionals work with trauma survivors. The study emphasized the importance of a comprehensive support system and the role of creative expression in healing. Rose's permission to share her story, with appropriate privacy protections, meant that her experience would help countless others. As Rose's 16th birthday approached, the Hendersons organized a celebration that honored both her past strength and her future potential. The party was held in the garden she had helped create, surrounded by blooming flowers and floating butterflies. Friends from school mingled with her support team from Haven House, creating a beautiful blend of her old and new lives. The gift that moved her most came from Officer Thompson, a bound collection of all the documentation from her case, redacted where necessary, but telling the story of how an entire community had come together to help one child find freedom. It was a reminder that she had never been as alone as she once believed, and that there were always people willing to help if one could find the courage to reach out. Looking toward the future, Rose began to see her traumatic past not as a burden to overcome, but as a source of strength that gave her unique insight and empathy. Her experiences shaped her career aspirations. She planned to study art therapy in college, hoping to help other trauma survivors find healing through creative expression. The final piece of her story fell into place when the Hendersons initiated adoption proceedings. Though legally an adult would soon be able to make her own choices, Rose wanted the permanent family connection that adoption would provide. The decision was celebrated by everyone who had been part of her journey, recognizing it as the culmination of a remarkable transformation from victim to survivor to thriver. Rose's story became a testament to the power of community, compassion, and resilience. It proved that with the right support, even the deepest wounds could heal. Her journey from darkness to light inspired others to speak up, reach out, and believe in the possibility of change. Most importantly, it showed that while trauma may be part of someone's story, it need not define their entire narrative.